Hello, and welcome to the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. I am Dimitris Plantzos, Professor of Classical Archaeology at the University of Athens. And this evening, I am pleased to introduce the fifth webinar in our series on ancient Greek painting in context. I'm happy to present this series with Professor Jenifer Niles, Director of the school, who is going to offer this evening's lecture. You can find the previous 4 webinars on the school's website. They looked at Bronze Age wall paintings in Knossos and Pylos, the fascinating archaic wall paintings from Kalapodi, Isthmia and Samos, and Athenian vase painting and its dependence on Etruscan tastes. Before proceeding to tonight's lecture, let me point out that there will be no meeting next week, March 25th, as that is Greece's national holiday, and actually this year sees the bicentenary of the Greek War of Independence in 1821 and the foundation of modern Greece. So, no webinar next week, but please join us the week after that on April 1st for a webinar by Professor Olga Palagia on Macedonian painting and the transformation of familiar images in a funerary context. Tonight we're returning to Athens for a look on one of the most famous paintings from classical antiquity, which was hiding inside the shield of the gold and ivory colossal statue of Athena that once stood in the Parthenon on the Athenian Acropolis. Although now lost, its complex imagery of the gods fighting the giants can be retrieved and reconstructed by a careful examination of late 5th century Attic vase painting. Our speaker this evening has conceived this new reconstruction, the first since 1940, using digital technology. Jenifer Niles, with a degree from Bryn Mawr College and a PhD from Princeton University, is the director of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, and actually she's the first woman to hold that position in the school's history. Formerly a professor at Case Western Reserve University, she served as chair of the American School's Academic Managing Committee from 2012 to 2017. As a field archaeologist, she has excavated in northern Greece, in Toroni, in Tuscany, in Poggio di Civitate, and in Morgantina in Sicily, and she has published material from all of these sites. A former curator of ancient art at the Cleveland Museum of Art between 1980 and 1986, she has organized two major exhibitions on the ancient world: Goddess and Polis, the Panathenaic Festival in ancient Athens in 1992, and Coming of Age in Ancient Greece, Images of Childhood from the Classical Past in 2003. As an art historian, she has written extensively on the Parthenon sculptures, Athenian vase painting, and iconography. Her most recent books are the British Museum Concise Introduction to Ancient Greece from 2008 and Women in the Ancient World from 2011. Professor Niles has held a number of distinguished fellowships, including at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, the American Academy in Rome, the Getty Research Center, and the Center for British Art at Yale University. She has been a visiting professor at the University of California at Berkeley and Johns Hopkins University, and she was the Martha Sharp Joukowsky Lecturer of the Archaeological Institute of America, an institution for which she also served for 4 years as Vice President for Publications. Since tonight we're happy to have Jenifer Niles as a speaker with us, I'm happy to present this book to you. Has just come out. It's the Cambridge Companion to Ancient Athens, edited by Professor Niles and Dylan K. Rogers. It's an excellent introduction to the history and archaeology of classical Athens. It's a very useful companion to anyone studying the archaeology of Athens. Without any further delay, it's over to Professor Niles for her webinar on the Gigantomachy on the Athena Parthenos shield. Please feel free to send us your questions for the Q&A session using the Q&A panel in the lower part of your screen, but please avoid to send your questions over the chat function because it's very difficult to monitor both. So, Professor Niles on the Parthenos shield.
Thank you, Dimitri, and many thanks to you for co-hosting our lectures on ancient painting, which have been quite a success given all the thousands of viewers who have tuned in. I'd like to welcome back all of you who have been participating in our webinar series and invite those who are just joining us to go to the American School's website to view our previous 4 webinars on earlier Greek painting. And there are more to come on April 1st and April 15th. Today we move into the classical period, the 5th and 4th centuries BC in Greece. Unfortunately, there are no extant large-scale paintings, largely because they were done on wooden panels which do not survive. However, later written sources like the 2nd century AD traveler Pausanias and the Roman natural scientist Pliny the Elder attest to a large number of paintings in 5th century Greece which are assigned to famous artists. These were hung in hero shrines, clubhouses, colonnaded public buildings known as stoas, like the Stoa Poikile, in the Propylaea on the Acropolis, and other indoor spaces where they were protected from the weather and where people congregated, much like modern museums. Most Greeks seem not to have had wall paintings in their houses in the classical period, and there were as yet no palaces in the various city-states that needed to have decoration. It was only in the later 4th century that tomb painting became popular, as we shall hear in the next webinar. It is of interest here that many of the artists mentioned by these written sources were both sculptors and painters, and since we know that sculpture was colored in antiquity, this is hardly surprising. Here you see a section of the low-relief frieze of the Parthenon, which demonstrates how much added color helps for an understanding of the complex scene of overlapping horsemen who are galloping along. According to our sources, the majority of the paintings in Athens were multi-figured depictions of battle, either mythological or historic. Favorite themes were the Centauromachi, the Amazonomachy, which we will hear more about shortly, and the Trojan War. Although they have long since disappeared, fortunately ancient authors describe these monumental paintings in some detail. In discussing the works of the earlier classical painter and sculptor Polygnotus, Pausanias uses phrases such as above or higher up. This has led scholars to see reflections of these monumental paintings in the works of Athenian vase painters, such as the so-called Niobid painter. Some of his larger vases have compositions in which the figures are arranged at different levels, as on his famous crater in the Louvre. Here Apollo and Artemis are killing off the children of the unfortunate Niobe. Note the active combatants in the upper part and the dead and dying below. If one combines this type of spatial composition with more colorful scenes on rare white ground vases, such as this crater by the Fiali painter, one can get a fairly good idea of what larger scale wall paintings of this period around 460 BC or so might have looked like. The most famous painting of this period was surely that by the Athenian painter Paninus of the Battle of Marathon, which took place in 490 BC. This painting was housed along with votive shields in the painted stoa, which is currently being excavated by the American School in the Agora. The panel painting was described in detail by Pausanias, and we learn that it was a large picture with many figures. In this reconstruction, we can see how the gods are arranged at the top level, the combatants in the middle register, and those dead and dying, mostly Persians, at the very bottom. According to Pliny, the painter Paninus was the brother of the famous Athenian sculptor Phidias. Paninus is said to have collaborated with his brother, having painted the inside of the shield of the chryselephantine statue of Athena at Elis by Phidias. Also, according to Pliny, Phidias was originally a painter, and he painted, and I quote, the shield in Athens, end quote. We shall return to this momentarily, but first let us look at the decorations of Greek shields and the important role they played in Greek identity. Going back to Professor Niemeyer's lecture in our series, and the wonderful Kiji Olpe, we note that the numerous shields are distinguished by their devices or episemas. Clearly, these were the personal identifying badges of the individual hoplites. They can be seen better in this rollout of the painting, where you will notice that every one is different from the next. Sort of like the masks we're all wearing today, they probably project the identity of the wearer in some way. In depictions of shields on Athenian vases, we often see the shield device echoing the persona of its carrier, as in this image of a youth participating in the hoplitodromos race. Shields were objects of value and were carefully tended, as we see on the right, where an Amazon is protecting her shield with a special cover. Even up to the early modern era, the shield was more than a piece of body armor. We can instantly recognize the ceremonial parade shield painted by Andrea del Castagno in 1450 as bearing a symbol of Florence, the young athletic biblical hero David representing the smallest principality in Italy with the severed head of the giant Goliath. Thus, the shield carries a message of warning to Florence's larger enemies. 100 years later, this Damascene steel shield of Charles V also conveys a message of victory in combat, in this case, the Catholic lead led by the Holy Roman Emperor over the Protestant German princes. Both shields in different formats and media bear narrative decoration, which serves to convey pertinent political and social messages to the viewer. Ceremonial shields also existed in antiquity. I show here one of the 3 painted wooden shields found at Dura Europos in modern Syria and dated to the mid-3rd century AD, now in the Yale University Art Museum. A rarity, it depicts 2 multi-figured battle scenes from the Iliad in a circular format. It seems to recall the shields of Greek warriors as described in epic poems. These elaborate narrative shields, detailed in ekphrastic literature, are those of the Greek heroes Achilles and Heracles. The shield of Achilles, commissioned by his mother Thetis from the smith god Hephaestus, takes up 130 lines in Book 18 of the Iliad. I won't read that here. And that of Heracles is described in 80 lines in an archaic epic poem. Because these are fantasy shields described by epic poets, they are covered with a multiplicity of scenes and are clearly thaumata, wonders to behold. More realistic, but still symbolic, are those described in Aeschylus's tragedy, The Seven Against Thebes. Here are meticulous accounts of each of the 7 warriors' shield devices, such as a man-eating sphinx or a fire-breathing typhon. Even a warrior climbing up a ladder on the enemy's fortification wall. Keep that in mind. Finally, a description of Alcibiades' shield is preserved in Athenaeus. I quote, "He carried a shield made of gold and ivory, on which there was the device of Eros with a thunderbolt, poised like a javelin." And in the 1970s, a gold and ivory shield was discovered in Macedonian Tomb 2 at Vergina. It was protected by a bronze cover seen here, and its decoration in gold and ivory shows the duel of Achilles and the Amazon Penthesilea, which took place during the Trojan War. We turn now to what was perhaps the most influential shield of all in antiquity, that of the colossal gold and ivory statue of Athena Parthenos, which towered over the worshiper in the Parthenon cella. This is the subject of my presentation today. Since the Bronze Age, the warrior goddess is defined by her shield, as exemplified on a well-known painted stucco plaque from Mycenae, where she stands before an altar and her votaries, or the gold ring from the shaft graves, where, as a tiny apparition, she floats above a religious scene. Unlike her helmet or spear, the shield is the most prominent and varied attribute of the goddess on Athenian vase painting, especially on Panathenaic prize amphoras, where the device changes with each and every painter. Given Athena's strong and age-old association with this item of armor, it is no surprise that Phidias took special pains to fabricate a tour de force for his first commission on the Acropolis, namely the colossal bronze statue of Athena that we know inaccurately as the Promachos. Please excuse the Assassin's Creed image here, but inaccurate as it might be, it does give more of a sense of the awe that the work no doubt inspired than the more pedestrian but accurate reproduction on the lower right. According to Pausanias, the shield of the statue was decorated with a Gigantomachy, composed and executed by other artists. The painter Parrhasius made the design, and the engraver Mies executed it. We have no evidence for this composition, although the south metopies of the Parthenon with the lapis fighting the centaurs could be later renditions of what we assume were similar jewels engraved on the bronze shield's exterior. Turning now to Phidias's colossal cult statue in the Parthenon, we have a little more evidence. Fortunately, this now lost masterpiece of Phidias was described in considerable detail by Pausanias. It was made of ivory for the visible parts of the body, and over a ton of gold was used for the drapery. It stood 10 meters tall, and its various reconstructions are based on numerous smaller-scale Roman copies. Pliny says of the statue, every tiny space afforded a field for art, and that, quote, on the convex face of the shield, he represented the battle of the Amazons, and on the concave part, the conflict between the gods and the giants. The Latin verb he uses is calavit, a term which is generally taken to mean carved low relief, akin to the Greek word torevo. This shield was approximately 5 meters or 16 feet in diameter, equal to half the height of Athena. It was the most accessible part of the statue because it was not held high on her left arm, but rested at her lower left side, as is evident on the later Roman copies. Here we see the Lenormand Athena in Athens, the Strangford shield in London, and a small terracotta token excavated in the Agora. These, among numerous other copies, demonstrate the accessibility of the shield to artists working in other media. Full-scale excerpted copies of its relief groups, duels between Greeks and Amazons, became the basis for several marble Neo-Attic reliefs produced in the Hadrianic period and found in a shipwreck in the Piraeus harbor. In an important article in 1981, Professor Evelyn Harrison proposed a new reconstruction of the Amazonomachy with a total of 30 figures. In a radical departure from other reconstructions, she included the elements of setting, namely fortification walls and a ladder, as integral parts of the original composition, and not additions by the Roman copyist, as originally supposed. This group, with an Amazon stepping off the parapet, clearly makes more sense when the topographical setting is indicated. A dead or dying Amazon, her right arm over her head and her left arm dangling along her side, comes from the lower right part of the shield. Keep it in mind, because we will return to this specific figure shortly. Meanwhile, as the Nashville Athena demonstrates, we assume that the shield's exterior was gilded bronze with relief figures on the outside and an ivory gorgonion in the center. But what of the interior of the shield? Without Pliny's statement, we would never know that it was decorated with the mighty battle of the gods versus the earth-born giants, what we call a Gigantomachy. A late 5th century BC vase known as the Baxi Crater, and now in St. Petersburg, and published by Brian Shefton, shows what looks to be the Athena Parthenos with her triple-crested helmet. It gives a hint of decoration on the inside of her shield. Here we see a nude warrior looking down to the right. I know it's difficult to see on the vase itself. It is also impossible to tell whether the figure is in relief, painted, or engraved. As for the technique used on the inside, there is some dispute which we will not settle here. Because Pliny uses one verb for both interior and exterior, some scholars, like Dorothy Thompson, argued that the inside had relief work. However, this seems highly impractical for a shield, which is carried on the arm. Evelyn Harrison suggested that the interior scene was painted on ivory. It sounds very attractive, but there is no evidence that the shield was made of ivory, which was used mostly for the flesh of female figures. As noted earlier, Pliny tells us that, quote, Phidias himself was originally a painter and painted a shield at Athens, end quote. So I take this as evidence that the interior of the Parthenos shield was painted. One surviving reduced copy of the shield, now in the British Museum and known as the Strangford Shield, does actually preserve the ghosts of what were thought to be two painted giants on its interior. However, as the Strangford Shield is the least faithful copy of the original shield's exterior, we should take these figures with a grain of salt. In an article in 1986, Arafat demonstrated fairly convincingly that these two giants are not likely to be quotations from the shield's interior. Giants don't usually sport French goatees, and the figure with two arms raised is more reminiscent of the earth goddess Gaia than a giant. The most often cited vase depicting a Gigantomachy, which is seen as a reflection of that of the shield, is this fragmentary Attic red figure crater in Naples attributed to the Pronomos painter and dated to 410 BC. In 1940, Arnold van Salis published the first comprehensive study of the shield's interior and based much of it on this vase painting, and most later scholars have followed his lead. It has led to what I call the tyranny of the Naples crater, since it is used for all reconstructions of the shield's interior. For many reasons, the composition and imagery of the Naples crater are problematic when viewed as a copy of the interior of the shield. A large arc separates the gods from their mother Gaia, seen at the lower right, and the 7 preserved giants. Above and partially concealed by the arc, Helios in his quadriga is at the right, balanced by the moon goddess Selene on her horse at the far left. This is seen as a Parthenonian motif, since the pair appear on the east pediment of the Parthenon, providing a cosmic framework, and probably also on the base of the statue with the birth of Pandora. But in the pediment, she is driving a 4-horse chariot, and it's possibly Nyx, according to some scholars. The arc separating the giants from the gods on the Naples vase and in Nada Lipin's reconstruction is an artificial division that may work on the vase surface, but there is little precedent for a circle inside a shield in this period. Rather, the normal features are the armband and the hand grip. We would also expect to see hilly topography representing Mount Olympus, similar to that of the Acropolis on the shield's exterior. The cosmic gods Selene and Helios are not relevant to the Gigantomachy, since the fight took place at night, hence perhaps its position on the dark interior of the shield. Finally, the presence of Gaia is problematic in this context. She is the surrogate mother of the Attic king Erecthonius, and is often depicted in this period as the embodiment of the Athenians' autochthony. Hence, her appearance on behalf of the enemies of the Greek gods on a major Athenian monument is problematic, in my opinion. In the latest reconstruction by Neda Lipin in 1970, all the giants, a total of 8, are in the center, enclosed in a circle, along with Gaia, who, as I've said, was the surrogate mother, but she was of the king, Erichthonius. The 12 gods are arranged around the periphery with a blank area where the snake would have appeared. We will come to the snake shortly. What this arrangement amounts to is shooting fish in a barrel, which is to say that it looks like no contest at all. This format is not consistent with the more aesthetically pleasing and narratively convincing arrangement of the Amazonamachy, which, as we have seen, takes place as individual duels on the slopes of the Acropolis. This design of Lipin's was so unsatisfactory that the sculptor who created the Athena Parthenos in Nashville, Alan Laguerre, felt obliged to move Heracles and Athena into the inner circle. So, is there any other evidence for the composition of this major painting? In his 1982 article on Amazons, John Boardman noted that although there are numerous Amazonamachy's on Attic vases of the last half of the 5th century, not one of them echoes the exterior of the Parthenos shield as we know it from numerous copies in the Piraeus reliefs. He goes on to say that any reconstructions of lost works of art based on vase imagery will, quote, inevitably be quite wrong in all the essential details, end quote. This statement may be true for relief sculpture, since painters are less likely to copy work in another medium. But if the interior of the shield was painted, we would expect to see reflections of its imagery on contemporary or later vases. In this brief foray into the relationship of lost imagery on the interior of the shield of Athena Parthenos with Attic vase painting, I will defy his warning and attempt to show how vases can, in fact, help us imagine what this painting might have looked like. Therefore, I would like to propose another Attic vase as more closely reflecting the imagery of the Parthenon shield, namely the so-called Melian neck amphora in the Louvre. It is attributed to the Sesula painter, named for the provenience of his major vases, which are neck amphoras with twisted handles. There are many compelling reasons to see this large, multi-figured vase as a close reflection of the shield. First, there are 30 combatants, the same numbers in the shield's Amazonamachy, as reconstructed by Harrison. Second, there is no problematic Gaia, nor Helios and Selene. Stylistically, the Sesula painter is close to the Parthenon, or as Furtwängler said, diese Art ist ganz Phidias. His art is entirely Phidian. Many of the poses of the gods on the vase echo those on the East metopes. To cite just one example, the duel of Athena and Enceladus in East Metope 4, although much damaged, closely resembles the same duel on the Louvre vase seen here in Furtwängler's drawing. The somewhat extraneous deities, Eros and Nike, also aid the gods in their battle on the vase and in the metopes. You can see Nike just behind Athena here on the metope. The Gigantomachy's are not identical, however, as Amphitrite, Hera, and Hephaestus seem to be absent from the vase, no doubt because on the metopes they are driving chariots, and I believe they're substituted by Demeter, Persephone, and possibly Hecate, 3 deities who appear above in the Parthenon's east pediment. The clincher for me that the Louvre amphora derives its imagery from the shield is the peculiar presence in the midst of this combat of a dead or dying Amazon. As far as I know, no Amazon belongs in the battle of the gods and the giants, nor are there any female giants in Greek mythology. With her right arm over her head and her dangling left arm dropping her weapon, she appears to be derived from the figure we have noted earlier, the dead or dying Amazon, seen at the bottom of the Amazonamachy on the exterior of the shield. Clearly, the Sesula painter sought a victim for Heracles' arrow and found one on the other side of the shield. And now we have another late 5th century vase with an interesting Gigantomachy. In 1989, in the necropolis of Trogilos, an ancient city in Thrace, an Athenian red figure Pelike came to light with a depiction of the Gigantomachy. It was published in 2011 by Maria Nicolai du Patera, who attributed it to the workshop of the Protomos painter. I'm indebted to her article, noted in the chat, for the color images shown here. A more abbreviated version, it nonetheless has many reminiscences of the Louvre amphora. A frontal nude Zeus is at the top with his long thunderbolt, and Athena just to the left, spear raised in her right hand and shield on her left shoulder. Particularly close is the duel of Hermes, seen at the upper right, with his striding pose and hair-pulling gesture. Along with it, I show a beautiful drawing by Catherine Schwab of the same scene as shown on the Louvre amphora. At this point, one might well ask how any artist could see the interior of the shield with the huge snake coiled inside. Most Roman replicas of the Athena Parthenos preserve a large snake covering much of the interior of the shield. Pausanias identified it as the earthborn king Erichthonius, and Pliny states that the serpent was particularly admired by experts. However, it is somewhat problematic in that it obscures the Gigantomachy, as demonstrated by the Nashville reconstruction. One, in fact, has to go around to the rear to appreciate the imagery. In many of the 4th century Attic document reliefs, representation of Athena, which echo the Parthenos, and on this coin from Aphrodisias, the snake is either absent or is at Athena's right side, opposite the shield, and under the Nike in her extended right hand. One of the earliest surviving depictions of the statue appears on this small terracotta token excavated in the Athenian agora and dating to the early 4th century BC. Therefore, it seems likely, as the agora director John Camp has argued, that the snake originally appeared on Athena's right to balance the shield, and only later, when a support was needed for the Nike, was a column added and the snake transferred to her left side. With the snake on Athena's right, one would have gotten an unimpeded view of the painting on the shield's interior, as in this mid-19th century silver statue by Pierre Simard. An unobstructed view of the interior decoration would have allowed artists, and in particular vase painters, to study and copy figures from the Gigantomachy. So, what might have the composition looked like? In a first attempt to demonstrate how the gods and giants on the Louvre amphora could be configured into a circular format, Catherine Schwab, whose drawing of the East Metapiece can be seen in the Parthenon Gallery now of the New Acropolis Museum, created this plausible arrangement. Zeus and his chariot can be placed in their logical spot at the apex, with Athena and Heracles fighting back-to-back just below. With the essential triad of Zeus, Athena, and Heracles at the top center, the other deities can be arranged within a circular format, keeping the paintings as seen on the vase, Apollo and Artemis. I omitted the dead Amazon and the Dioscuri, who seem to be fillers on the vase. In a second iteration, which I undertook with my students in 2016, we moved in more of the figures from the Louvre amphora to achieve the same number on the interior as the exterior, namely 30. In the mid-level, we placed Apollo and Artemis, Ares and Aphrodite, and at the lower level, the gods pertaining to the underworld, like Demeter, Persephone, and Hecate. Using digital technology, we were able to play with the figures, moving them around in various configurations, as you'll see us doing here. The students then, using computer programming, fabricated a shield in wood with the new design etched into the two surfaces. This new reconstruction of the interior of the Parthenos shield is admittedly hypothetical, but the style, number, and types of divine figures derived from the Louvre amphora better suit the Phidian creation and conform with what we know of the exterior design much better than the Naples crater, which has dominated all previous reconstructions, and thereby hindered our understanding of this important monument. Together, the two compositions on the shield present a radically new perspective on spatial depictions in Greek narrative art. The figures are placed in a landscape setting, as one would expect of major painting, but for which we have no surviving examples. The deliberate back-to-back placement of the two battles, one on Mount Olympus and the other on the Acropolis, resonates with the pediments of the Parthenon, where the birth of Athena on Olympus is depicted in the east pediment and the contest between an Athena and Poseidon over Attica in the west. In both instances, this deliberate juxtaposition suggests that the Athenians were elevating their heroic ancestors who fought off the barbarian Amazons to a par with the Olympians who destroyed the barbaric giants. In the context of Greek religion, Athena's definitive role in the defeat of the giants was celebrated every 4 years in the great Pan-Athenic festival in her honor. The high point of the festival was the presentation of a special woolen garment, the peplos, in which the women of Athens had woven the Gigantomachy. Thus, the imagery on Athena's great shield resonated with several contexts, not only with the East Metapiece of the Parthenon, likely designed by Phidias, but also with Athena's birthday gift. More importantly, the vast expanse of this shield, 16.5 meters in area, offered the painter and sculptor Phidias a large canvas to exhibit his creativity. Unlike metapiece friezes and pediments with their dominant horizontal ground line, the shield provided a free, open field for expression, not one confined to a linear narrative. Like Michelangelo, who began his career as a sculptor, when offered the vast blank expanse of the Sistine ceiling, he met the challenge and produced the greatest masterpiece of his career. We may never know what exactly Phidias designed for the shield of his Athena Parthenos, or whether he actually painted it himself, as I would like to believe, but I hope that this new version of the shield's interior is at least an improvement on previous attempts. It is based on the belief that Attic vase painters were indeed influenced by major works of art in their vicinity, and readily adapted the imagery to their smaller scale ceramic productions. In so doing, they paid homage to one of the greatest monuments of classical antiquity.
Thank you, Professor Niles, for this fascinating exploration of a mysterious subject, talking about one of Greece's most elusive masterpiece, a discussion of iconography, of mythology, mythography, and this presentation of the statue of Athena, but also Parthenon itself as a large canvas, as you said, where Phidias and the collective imagination of the Athenian people would express their sense of belonging, the sense of identity. So, as we're gathering questions from the Q&A panel, I would like to ask you, beginning this discussion, do you think that the statue of Athena was conceived as a collection of images that somebody sat down and thought of the statue, this huge surface, as a possibility, as an opportunity to illustrate in a programmatic sense what Athens was all about?
Yes, just before I answer that question, I just want to tell our audience that it was 1 year ago, practically today, that we pivoted, as everyone says, from our public lecture series in our auditorium to doing these online presentations. And I want to thank one person, our executive producer here, Konstantinos Georginos, who has made us all look very good with his technical and artistic expertise. And we really appreciate it, and you'll see more to come in our future programming. So thank you, Konstantinos. Okay, the question about the statue. The statue certainly, it's actually the only part of the Parthenon that we know was done by Phidias. We don't have any indication that he did the beautiful pediments or metopes or frieze, although we'd like to think he had some role there. But what's so interesting about the statue is it reprises almost every one of the narratives that are in the sculpture. So we have, the Amazons on the outside of the shield, they're on the west metapiece. On the inside, we have the giants, they're on the east metapiece. Even her sandals were decorated with the Battle of the Centaurs, which was the subject of the south metapiece. So there's clearly this incredibly close connection and a programmatic, connection between these. Athena herself appears, of course, in the center, practically, of both pediments. It's her birth story and her contest with Poseidon that are featured. So it's really all about Athena. And I don't know if the question will come up, but we'll say, well, what does she have to do with the Amazons, the Battle of the Amazons? And that's because she is a patron goddess of heroes. And the most important hero of Athens, of course, was Theseus, who slayed the Minotaur, but he did a lot of other things too, including fighting with the Amazons, supposedly on the very slopes of the Acropolis. So this is, I think, one reason why that particular subject is featured on the outside of the shield, whereas the Centaur battle, another battle of Theseus, is on the shield outside on the big, huge bronze statue.
Thank you. I think it's obvious, studying Greek art and also especially Greek art in a sanctuary, that the way Greeks understood visibility was totally different from our own. And there is a question about visibility regarding the statue, and you talked about it as well. So we have a question about the importance of Gigantomachy as a subject. And why do you think that subject was placed on the interior rather than the exterior of the shield? But I suppose Amazonomachy is also important.
Well, I made a tentative suggestion that it's on the inside because it's a nighttime battle and it's the darker side of the shield. I don't know if that will convince anyone. And I think it was visible. What's the first part of the question? Sorry.
Why do you think that such an important subject to Athens and Athena was placed in the interior rather than the exterior of the shield?
Yeah. Let me say about I think the question actually was about the existence of the Gigantomachy in general. And it goes back to, on the Acropolis anyway, to 566, the founding date of the Panathenea, where we suddenly get all these dedications of monumental vases by important painters. This is in the black figure technique of gods fighting the giants. They're almost like the theogonies. So we get every giant, every god and every giant. They're big vases, they're important, and because they're dedicated on the Acropolis, they obviously were felt by the painters themselves or the potters to be important expressions of their craft. So, and Athena was a goddess of craftsmanship. That's another aspect we didn't get into, but that's why a lot of these vases, I think, feature her in the battle of the gods and the giants. And I might also, because I didn't have time to get into this, mention the fact that in order for the gods to defeat the giants, they had to have a mortal fighting on their side, and that was Heracles. And it was Athena who, again, goddess, connected with heroes, who brought Heracles into the battle to help them win it. But there are many, many Gigantomachy's, and in fact, an earlier temple of Athena, a 6th century temple on the Acropolis, showed this in the pediments, this very scene in the pediments. So it was not an unusual scene at all in Athenian art.
Thank you. Well, talking about the time, daytime or nighttime, there's a question regarding Helios. You say that Helios in his quadriga has no place in the Gigantomachy painted inside the shield, but of course he is present on Metope E14, part of that Gigantomachy sequence. What's going on is the question.
Okay. I actually wrote a whole article on E14. That's the northernmost Metope on the east side of the Parthenon. And I did this actually with an undergraduate student and one of my colleagues in classics, in which he, the student, found a passage in the Argonautica that said that Helios came to the rescue of Hephaestus, who is the lame smith god, who got tired fighting the giants. So it's a rescue chariot, it's the ambulance chariot, so to speak. And who's in the next Metope E13 but Hephaestus fighting a giant? So I think it's not the time of day because we don't have the moon setting on the other end of as we often do when they're trying to suggest a cosmic or time of day setting. So I think he's playing a different role in that metope from being a cosmic god representing daybreak.
Well, another question you touched upon your seminar this evening was the correspondence between vase painting in general and painting or sort of monumental art at large. So there's a question from Amalia Avramidou. How accessible was the cella to the Baunassoi, the vase painters, to study the painting? And on that note, she adds, I would suppose that there were sketches circulating or perhaps previews before the final setting of the shield.
That's entirely possible, that there were, we think of sketchbooks and things like that carry this imagery. We have no way of proving that one way or the other. There's also, we should remember, a pool of water in front of the statue, which may have made it a little difficult to get to. It was supposedly to keep the ivory from drying out, but when I look at some of these early document reliefs, of which I showed one, the shield seems to be curved out at a diagonal, so it was almost as if it was showing off the inside more than the outside. Now, we can't really know, but without the snake and with it, slightly turned to the side, opened out, I think you could see it better. And remember how big these figures are. I mean, this shield is 5 feet tall. It's really 5 meters tall. I'm sorry, 5 meters tall. It's huge.
Do you think it's possible some of those vase painters and other artists might have been inspired through oral descriptions of the subject matter by somebody who actually saw it? Do you think they may have created mental images in their heads which they then conveyed into their medium? Do you think it's possible?
Yeah, well, we do think that's the case for the Battle of Marathon. Actually, it was the other way around, that writers were inspired by the picture that they saw to write the narrative of the battle based on the painting, but which comes earlier than Herodotus. So anyway, I don't know. There would certainly, there's what I call this ekphrastic literature, elaborate descriptions of the ones I cited were shields. Those are the most famous, where they go on and on and on about what the shield of Achilles, you can't picture it because there's so many possible scenes on it. But I think actually that Phidias was trying to compete with Hephaestus. Of course, this is the god of craft, and he's trying to do one better with the Parthenos shield, or one equal to that of the great smith god.
There's a question about painting and the statue. Apart from the shield, the question says, are there any indications that the goddess's tunic or the helmet were also painted over? If so, are there any indications as to the themes employed?
Well, you may have noticed on the Melian, the amphora, the Louvre amphora, that the garments of the goddesses in particular, because they wear long, peploi, chitons, dresses, have bands of, Pegasus was the one most obvious, but I mean, they have bands of ornament. Now, none of the copies, it's probably too small of a detail for any of the later Roman copies to reflect that, but certainly textiles were a very, very important element in ancient art, totally lost to us. And they were very valuable, hence the fact that one was a gift to Athena. And they were, that was the major gift to her, was a garment, a piece of, probably rectangular fabric that could be made into a garment. So it's possible that it was overpainted or etched onto the ivory, but all we know is that the drapery parts, we're told, were ivory, and the flesh parts were ivory, and the drapery was gold. It was gilding some sort, sheets of gold hammered onto a wooden core, we think.
Right, but I'm sure you're right about the importance of textiles and tapestries as the missing link in the diffusion of imageries in those days. And we hear of stories of interiors of palaces or temples with tapestries hanging from the ceiling with images on them. So I'm sure there's a connection there. Now, Karim Arafat is with us. He says, you say the Naples crater is not as relevant as has previously been suggested, but it is worth noting that the vault of heaven, which separates the giants below from the gods above on the crater, gives the composition a very shield-like composition. Is that a coincidence, he asks?
That's a very good question. And I'm not sure I have an answer for it. So where is it coming from? Is that an invention of the painter of the Naples crater, or is he being inspired by some other flat image? I can't really say. I just intensely dislike this arrangement with all the giants on the inside and the gods on the outside. It just doesn't make any sense. And I was trying, obviously, to posit that if it's designed the outside in such a way with architecture and in a circular format, with the jewels arranged around the surface of the vase, the surface of the shield, we would find something similar on the inside. And I'm not sure, I've looked at the interior of shields. In fact, a lot of the images I showed you, you might have noticed that there's a lot of imagery floating around when you get to see the inside of a shield in late 5th century vase painting. And you don't really see it on an arc. So I can't really explain that because we don't find it in too many other images. Sometimes with Helios, Selene, or Nyx, there's an arc of heaven in some representations. So it may come from that, and maybe a convention that's used.
I must confess, however, that this shield-like circle on the vase always fooled me, but I suppose you you know better. There are two observations by Julia Scheer. One is about Theseus. Theseus, she says, had another connection with the Parthenon and the Acropolis. And the other is the Gigantomachy is one of the major atia of the Panathenaia. That is why all the Gigantomachyes are on the Acropolis and on the Parthenon.
Yes, many people believe that the Panathenaea celebrated the victory of the gods over the giant, of Athena and the gods over the giants, but that was a victory of all the gods, not just of Athena, even though she played a key role.
There's an invitation by Martha Payne to explain again why you do not think that the representation of Gaia on the interior of the shield is problematic, because as she says, she shows up in the Pergamene altar, but of course Pergamon is not Athens, but you'd better explain that.
Yeah. She's on the Pergamon altar because she's pleading for her children who are the giants, just as we see her doing on the Naples crater. The reason I don't want her in an Athenian context is because she is this surrogate mother for Athena and Hephaestus for this child, which was the result of the impregnating of the earth by Hephaestus. It's a long, sexy story. I won't go into it, but this autochthonous or earthborn child became the most important king of Athens, the warrior king who defeated the Eleusinians in battle, et cetera, and I believe he is a key player in the Parthenon imagery, and I just think it would be not unseemly, but inappropriate to have his mother there on the shield advocating for the enemies of the gods.
Well, as you said, it's all about politics. There's a question about Phidias and Parthenos. Why do you think the painter was Phidias rather than Parthenos, as sources say?
That the painter was Phidias rather than Parthenos?
Yeah,
Parthenos is not credited with this shield. I mean, well, it could have been. I'm sure he had assistants. His brother probably helped him paint it. I mean, it was a huge commission. And Phidias himself was busy with the gold and the ivory parts, too. Since we don't, they're all working in a Phidian style, I would say, a Parthenonian style. So it would be hard to say who painted what. But we do know there is a story that Phidias had himself depicted on the exterior of the shield along with Pericles. So if that seems like a later made up, legend, but if it has any credibility to it, then it shows that Phidias took a personal interest in the shield.
Certainly. There's a question by Robert Sutton. Are Amazons a stand-in for the Persians who had successfully attacked the Acropolis not too long before?
Well, that's said, but there are some problems with that analogy of Persians and Amazons. The Persians actually did make it up to the Acropolis and sacked and destroyed it, whereas the whole point of this Amazonamachy is that they're fended off by Theseus and his fellow Athenians. So we do like to say that because these monuments come after the Persian Wars, and because we actually believe, and I do, that the Parthenon is a victory monument for the great Athenian victories at Marathon and Salamis, that some of this imagery does relate back to that cataclysmic event that the Athenians went through, because it's all battle imagery. I mean, all of the metopes are related to battle and these scenes on the shield. And the presence of Nike is a huge factor in this too, I might add. She's in the palm of Athena's hand, but she's also behind her in the East 4 metope where she's fighting the giant, and she's all over this building. So it's all about victory in battle.
There's an observation by Judy Barringer. I think, she says, the issue of visibility to humans is not so important. The primary viewer was Athena. Now, and people say that about the frieze as well, that it doesn't matter if nobody can see it, and nobody actually saw it in antiquity, as far as the gods themselves are able to see it. Do you subscribe to this point of view?
Well, not really, because we have, in one chapter of my book on the Parthenon frieze, I spent a whole chapter talking about the impact, the Nachleben, shall we say, of this imagery. It's on vases. I mean, they're identical scenes sometimes on vases from the frieze. So they saw it. I mean, I think that slide I showed you with the paint on it indicates how visible this was. And Bonna Westcott did a wonderful experiment at the Nashville Parthenon with her students. Again, we all use our students. To make a mock-up, a colored mock-up of the frieze. They got a cherry picker, put it right up on the top of the Nashville Parthenon, and they had people in the park say, could you see this? What could you see? How could you see it? And I think it made the case very, very clearly that these things were visible to viewers.
Talking about your previous book, I have people asking here, has this paper been published, or is it going to be, and where and when?
Well, I just wrote it for this webinar, so I'm not sure I have all the footnotes ready, but I would like to publish it. I want to work more with the digital imagery on the shield, and then I thank Konstantinos Georginos, who's helping me with this, because we have extracted all of the wonderful drawings from Furtwängler-Reichhold of the vase, and I want to work on a new, more carefully worked out arrangement and with an explanation as to which gods I placed where in much greater detail. So I will continue to work on it. Thank you.
There's a question about the exterior of the shield. Does the image of Medusa on the hoplite shield? Oh, sorry, it's about hoplite shields in general. Does the image of Medusa on the hoplite shield have another function besides as an identification sign?
Oh yes, it turns your enemy to stone. I mean, it's a very good image to have on your shield. It was not only on the shield there of Athena, of course it was on her aegis. It was given to her by Perseus, and she put the head of the Gorgon on her breastplate. So it's a double, associated with Athena, but it's also on the shield of Achilles quite frequently, and other heroes. So it's not a badge of any one particular person, I wouldn't say, but it's just this idea that it's apotropaic. It's to fend off your enemy. It may not have, with Athena, it has a specific identity, but I don't know about all the other times it's used. You even saw it on the Gigantomachy very early on.
Oh yeah, in the Olpi, obviously, people were fascinating with this new iconography of weaponry. There are a lot of questions about how reliable are our sources. Written sources. And there's a question. The first question actually we got was about the marathon painting in the Stoa Poikili. How certain can we be about the reconstruction of the marathon painting?
The reconstruction?
The reconstruction, based on
well, we can't. We really can't. Because those figures aren't described in a lot of detail. We're told, for instance, Theseus is rising from the ground. So he's shown as a figure, a half-length figure coming out of the ground. I mean, we have some details like that. But in general, and we know, what's really interesting about the marathon paintings, we know the sequencing of it. We know that Miltiades is at the beginning, bringing the troops in. Then we have the battle, raging. And then finally, we're told we have the ships of the Persians trying to leave, and them trying to depart, and the Greek hero holding onto the ship. That is a temporal and spatial progression, which is very important because you go temporally from the beginning to the end of the battle, and you move across the plain of Marathon to the sea. I think this had a really big impact on Phidias because that's exactly what the Parthenon frieze does. We have the beginnings of the day of the Festival of Athena. We progress through various stages, events, chariot race, etc., until we get to the end on the east side of the Parthenon. So I think this was a kind of a radical idea. You needed a large, linear format to carry out a narrative like this. So I think it was very influential on Phidias, but we don't actually know in detail what it looked like. Because it's not reflected, it's not reflected in vase painting as far as we know. We do have it on the Nike temple. There is one of the South frieze, I think it is South, shows the Battle of Marathon, but it's obviously a much abbreviated version.
There's a question about the Gigantomachy on the Great Altar of Pergamon. And the question is if you use it for your reconstruction. So I know you don't, so I'm going to reverse the question and ask you, do you think it was influenced at all by the depiction of the Gigantomachy in Athens?
Well, that's a great question, and I started to look into that, but I really didn't have time to pursue it. But it is a good question because we know that the Athena on the Pergamon altar and the Zeus are based on the two central figures of the Parthenon's west pediment, Athena and Poseidon. It's very clear that they're adapted. And so what else might have that designer have looked at? Now remember, you have to realize that it's a huge high relief frieze. It's infinitely long. They had to invent practically new gods to fight the giants because there were so many. Also, the giants have snaky legs, which is totally different. It's a new way of representing giants because they're earthborn. They're given snake lower bodies. So in that sense, it's not at all like the interior, as I see it, of the shield. But there may be poses. So I'm going to go back and maybe when the pandemic's over, I'll go to Berlin and take a close look.
A question about the iconography again. Do you support the theory that the subjects on the metopiece in frieze had above all a teaching character towards people, for example, about moral values and the victory against barbarism?
I'm not sure the question. Do the themes of the
those images operated as templates for human behavior?
Models,
yeah.
Heroic, yeah, yes. I think from early on, any of these battle scenes were meant, could have been meant to encourage young men to train and build up their bodies and become good warriors, because as we know from the Iliad, the greatest way to achieve aristeia was to go out and fight. And so that was very much the mentality of the ancient Greeks. And the Athenians took particularly pride in the fact that they were out fighting as independent, democratic, free men, as opposed to the more enslaved forces of the Persians. So, and it was, the marathon was the first test of the Athenian democracy. And obviously it's exceeded beyond their wildest expectations, since they were so outnumbered. So yes.
And as we're reaching the end of this discussion, there's a question about the interior versus the exterior of not just the shield, but also pottery or other artifacts. Do you think, is the question, there was a meaning behind this polarity between inside and outside? What went inside of a pot, and what went on outside it, or as in this case, a shield?
Well, in the case of ceramics, frequently there are two sides basically to most pots, except cups. There's a front and a back, and they often have nothing to do with each other. We can try to make elaborately argued cases for it, but sometimes they're just, it's what the artist felt like painting. I think in the case of this shield, though, as I said, the outside is the Acropolis of Athens, the inside is Olympus. That's exactly what we have in the east and the west pediments. We have Olympus, where Athena's born, and we have Attica, where this contest takes place, and it's a way of elevating Athens to, the divine sphere, or at least making a conscious parallel between their heroic actions and those of the gods. You could call it hubris, but it's definitely a deliberate juxtaposition.
And perhaps a postscript. There's a question about Hecate.
Yeah.
Why is she there? She's thought to be an underworld version of Artemis, but I don't think, says Martha Payne, there are many representations of her. Is there an explanation?
Well, Hecate is, going back to the Pergamon altar, there's a fabulous Hecate fighting the giants there. But because there were three goddesses in, fighting, and they're fighting with torches. And this is a symbol often of the underworld. So I opted for Persephone. There's one with a scepter, which I thought would be Demeter. And then the third one would obviously be Hecate, because we think that she's the figure running with torches in the Parthenon pediment. So that's why this is tentative. There was, of course, the Hecate Epipyrgidia, the three-bodied Hecate statue at the entrance to the Acropolis. So she's a figure that's associated with that sanctuary too. And they might have wanted to give her a bigger role in her mythology by putting her on the shield, but that remains to be seen.
Well, so a work in progress then.
Yes.
We look forward to the next installment and the finished results. In the meantime, I suppose it's time to say goodbye to everyone, to thank everyone for tuning in this evening, to remind everyone that our next webinar will be 2 weeks from today on April 1st with Olga Palagia and Macedonian painting. And I think I will let you have the final word.
Okay, well, thank you, Dimitris, for coming and hosting this along with, or moderating it, since I couldn't be the moderator this time, so I appreciate it. Thank you, all of you out there, for these great questions that will make me think more on this topic. And I know that a lost monument that doesn't exist is not maybe what the audience expected in a webinar on ancient painting, but that's the luck of the draw. We just don't have large-scale paintings from classical antiquity. Maybe someday we will have more material coming out of the ground to give us more insights into this really important area of ancient Greek art. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.